The heavy iron-bound doors of the courtroom creaked open with a sound that felt like a final judgment, admitting a draft of cold air that mirrored the icy atmosphere of the room. High above the floor sat Judge Stone, a man whose reputation for being unyielding and devoid of emotion had earned him his namesake among the legal community. He was a figure of shadows and sharp angles, his black robes draped over him like a heavy curtain that separated him from the warmth of the living world. Below him sat Samuel, a humble man with calloused hands and a face etched with the weariness of a life spent in hard labor. He had been accused of a high-stakes robbery, a crime he insisted he had not committed, yet the circumstantial evidence was being woven into a tight noose around his future. The room was heavy with the silence of despair until a small, vibrant figure walked toward the witness stand. A young girl named Maya, carrying a worn sketchbook and a small box of pastels, moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to push back the gloom of the massive chamber. Maya looked up at the towering presence of Judge Stone, her eyes clear and filled with a radiant hope that seemed out of place in such a somber setting. She knew her father was the kind of man who would give his last crust of bread to a stranger and who spent his evenings teaching her how to see the hidden beauty in the world. She didn't understand the complex laws being debated, but she understood the truth of the human heart. "Your Honor," she began, her voice small but remarkably steady. "My daddy didn't take anything that wasn't his. He says the only treasure worth having is the light we find in each other." A few officials in the gallery whispered in disbelief, but the judge remained a statue of granite, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the child. Maya took a deep breath and made a proposal that felt like a lightning strike in the quiet room. "If you let my daddy come home, I will show you how to see the colors again. I will help you finish the painting that stopped in your heart many years ago. I know you only see gray, but I can bring back the blue of the sky." The judge's hand froze over his legal pad, his fingers tightening around his pen until it nearly snapped. He had lost his only daughter in a tragic accident years ago, a girl who had been a gifted young painter, and since that dark day, he had lived in a world of monotone shadows, banning art and joy from his isolated life. He believed that the law was the only truth left, a cold and logical structure that didn't require the messy interference of feelings. Yet, looking at Maya, he saw a spark of a memory he had tried to bury under a mountain of paperwork. She wasn't just asking for mercy. She was offering a restoration of his very soul. The prosecutor rose to dismiss the child's words as a sentimental distraction, but Judge Stone raised a trembling hand, his eyes finally meeting Maya's. He saw a courage in her that was older than her years. He decided to do something that defied every precedent in his long career. He granted a temporary suspension of the trial, allowing Samuel to remain under house arrest for 1 month, provided Maya fulfilled her strange and beautiful promise. For the next 4 weeks, the judge's cold and echoing mansion became an unexpected studio of light and color. Every afternoon, Maya would arrive with her art supplies, her presence acting like a sunrise in the dusty, dark hallways of the estate. At first, the judge would sit in his study, staring at the wall, refusing to look at the paper. He was gruff and dismissive, telling her that the world was a cruel place and that colors were just an illusion. But Maya was undeterred. She didn't start by asking him to draw. She simply sat near him and talked about the different shades of the wind and the way the morning light felt like a warm hug. She began to draw small sketches of the garden, showing him that even in the dead of winter, there was life waiting to bloom. Slowly, the judge's defenses began to crumble like old stone. He found himself watching her hands move across the paper, and the silence of his home began to feel less like a fortress and more like an empty canvas waiting for a first stroke. One rainy afternoon, as the gray clouds pressed against the windows, Maya pulled out a large sheet of paper and handed a bright yellow pastel to the judge. She didn't say anything. She just pointed to a small, unfinished sketch of a sun she had started. For a long time, the judge stared at the vibrant color, his breath hitching in his chest. Then, with a hand that shook with decades of suppressed grief, he reached out and added a single, bold ray of light to the drawing. Tears that had been frozen for 10 years began to flow down his face, washing away the dust of his bitterness. In that moment, he realized that by closing himself off from pain, he had also blinded himself to the beauty of existence. He saw that Samuel was not just a defendant, but a father who was the sole source of color in this child's life. He began to review the evidence of the case with a new perspective, one that looked for the truth of the man rather than just the facts of the file. The month ended, and the courtroom was packed once again, the air thick with tension and curiosity. The atmosphere was remarkably different. It felt as though a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for an eternity. Judge Stone walked to his bench, but his movements were fluid and human, no longer the mechanical gestures of a man of stone. He looked down at Maya and Samuel, who were sitting together in the front row, their hands locked in a bond of unbreakable love. The judge began to speak, his voice no longer a cold echo, but a resonant and sincere sound. He announced that his own thorough review of the bank's security logs, prompted by a feeling that things were not as they seemed, had revealed a digital glitch that had misidentified Samuel. He dismissed all charges immediately, but then he did something that would be engraved in the history of the court. He stood up, descended from his high seat, and walked toward the little girl who had challenged him. "You kept your promise, Maya," the judge said, a genuine and warm smile illuminating his face like a beacon of light. "You taught me that justice is not just about the weight of the law, but about the depth of our compassion. You didn't just save your father. You saved a man who had forgotten how to live in a world of color." He reached into his robe and pulled out a small, silver palette pin that had belonged to his late daughter, pinning it carefully to Maya's sweater. The courtroom erupted in a standing ovation, a wave of applause that felt like the breaking of a long and bitter winter. Samuel hugged Maya, his tears of relief shining like diamonds under the courtroom lights. The judge stood with them, no longer a cold arbiter of fate, but a participant in their joy. He realized that the most important verdict he had ever delivered was the one that granted him his own freedom from the shadows of his past. The story concludes with a vision of a world transformed. The judge did not leave his post, but he became a legendary figure of fairness and empathy, often visiting schools to talk about the importance of art and emotion in the pursuit of truth. Samuel and Maya remained his lifelong friends, and the once dark mansion was now filled with paintings and the laughter of children from the community programs the judge helped fund. Maya grew up to be a world-renowned artist, but she always maintained that her most important work was the one she created with a single yellow pastel in a cold study. The judge's home was now a place of vibrant light, and the law was no longer a wall, but a bridge. They had proven that even in the harshest of environments, a single stroke of hope, guided by a child's innocence, can rewrite the story of a soul and bring the colors back to a heart that had forgotten how to dream.